Laughter is the best medicine. You know, I want to share this one with you because my daughter gave it to me. So I figured, oh, she's a woman. It's okay to share it. But she ran across this and she thought it was hilarious. She said, why do men go to bars to meet women? The strategy is all wrong. First of all, they need to go to Target. First of all, they're outnumbered 10-1. And secondly, and more importantly, they're in the right frame of mind. They're already looking for something they don't really need. I thought that was funny. Anyway, last week I introduced a book by Reverend Paul Smith titled Integral Christianity, The Spirit's Call to Evolve. And Reverend Smith has been at that Broadway church downtown Kansas City for like 50 years. Started as a Southern Baptist. I told you that last week, but just in case you weren't here. And it changed into this, completely different. And along with the idea, I introduced, along with the book, I introduced the idea of the book, which is in integral theory. And integral theory represents a manner of understanding, an approach to understanding a subject, any subject, not just religion or whatever, from a broader perspective. And I did a quick poll, and nobody's ever heard of, very few people have ever heard of integral theory. And so I found it so fascinating that I think it's something that it would be fun to get together as a group. And maybe I should, I used to have a book club study, and it was called Let's Get Metaphysical. And maybe we just go ahead and call it that, because that's kind of what it is. Anyway, integral theory is a creation of a man named Ken Wilber. And the book describes him as the most famous contemporary philosopher and mystic you have never heard of. Essentially, it's bringing together, I put it this way, like creating small little puzzles that are a whole picture, and then taking all these puzzles, putting them together to create a bigger puzzle with a bigger picture. That's what this is kind of about. And it helps us identify where we are in our spiritual journey. And where do we want to go? Where are we going and how to get there? He uses something he refers to as the spiritual positioning system, which he equates something like a GPS. And he says that like all software, our spiritual positioning system needs to be updated now and then. And I said, well, that's interesting. We can relate to this new terminology of computers, and that's an whole other story. But anyway, and this is essentially what integral theory is trying to do, is get us to update our spiritual software. And he begins by telling us that there's all these levels of stages of development that we go through as individuals and as well as a humanity. And the stages are tribal, warrior, traditional, modern, postmodern, and then what he calls integral and beyond. And I didn't have a chance to say too much about them specifically last time. So in summary, let me briefly say that the first one, the tribal stage, is something like when we were children, infants. We're very dependent upon the tribe, the family. I mean, in fact, you can't even survive without the tribe, without the family. But you're also very egocentric. Everything is about you and what you want right now. I don't care what you're doing, Mom. I need something now. And so you're at that stage. And people in this stage see God as separate from everything. And though he still intervenes in human affairs somehow. And it's a small percentage. It's only like 10% of the population. And the next stage is the warrior stage, the warrior consciousness. And it's ruled by that might is right idea. The religious terrorism is founded in this mentality, as well as the holy wars, the crusades, the inquisitions, all these things. And the mission is convert or destroy. That was the mission of this mindset. And again, the Bible is literal for these people, and they're attracted to apocalyptic books like Daniel, Revelation, and in this mindset. And that's not surprising, because apocalypticism, as I said before, is all about the grand battle between good and evil at the end of times. That's what apocalypticism is. And at this stage, Jesus took the terrible punishment that God demanded to make amends with mankind. After that, you get into, now this is about 20% of the population that are in this mindset. Then you get into the traditional church, and you start to fit in to everything. You fall into the status quo, and you may start to question some things, but not the things that you believe. And all mainstream religion is in the traditional stage, in this traditional mindset. The Catholics, the Baptists, the Methodists, the Episcopalians, everybody's, they're all in there. And in human terms, it's like when you reach that stage where you get married, you fit into society, you buy a home, you move out to the suburbs, and you're in that little, and you don't really buck the system. You just kind of grew into it. So that's where that mindset is. And again, the teaching that Jesus died for the sins of the world is dominant in that mentality. And the teachings of Jesus, because remember, I've told you several times, early on, Christianity had two ways they could go. They could have gone with Jesus and Jesus' message and Jesus' example, or the message of Paul, which was salvation. Jesus didn't talk about salvation. This is all Paul. And what happened was we took the direction of Paul. And Christianity, traditional Christianity that you see now, is really Paulism. And it's not really about Jesus. It really isn't. And so between these three stages, we have like almost 80% of the population exists mentally, spiritually developing in these stages. That only leaves 20%. And we still got the modern, postmodern, and integral to go. That's not a whole lot of people up there. So this brings me to the modern church. And it began only 500 years ago. And with the age of enlightenment, with the age of reason, that's where all that, and it created the birth of this country, the modern era. That's what it created. And this is the first time that we started thinking in bigger terms, in world-centric terms. And that in itself is a major marker, because when you start changing your focus, your mentality from me, like the infant stage, to we, then you are on the right path. You're starting to see things on a bigger scale as a humanity. And you're looking at things from a spiritual perspective. That's why this nationalism thing is like, honestly, it's contrary to spiritual growth. Because, again, it's division. It's us, it's them. And so we need to think big picture. Now, the upside of this era were a lot of advancements in medicine and science. The downside is that it created this greed, this materialism, and a separation from spirit, because science now began to reason things and try to understand how everything was going on, and now they became the authority on the universe, whereas before the church was always. You wanted answers to the universe? Any answers of what you want? Go to the church. They got all the answers. And now science says, we don't need, with Newtonian physics and stuff, that we don't need that anymore. We've got this figured out, And so this age of reason really challenged the church. And they started to apply this reason to religion. And so this is when the New Thought movement was born in the modern age. And so you have Christian science, science of mind, divine science. What does all this have in common? Science. So, and unity was born in this modern era. And so they took the mindset that if there are physical laws, then there must be spiritual laws. And we took that for a while and wrote on that thing for a bit. But that kind of makes it a little deterministic until quantum came along and said, oh, no, you don't got this figured out at all. And I read somewhere that about the year 1900, the head of the physics department at Harvard made a speech, and he said, we've got this all figured out. We just need to tweak a couple of things and make a little adjustment. We got it all figured out. And then quantum physics came along and said, yeah, you think so? I got to share something I shared with Liz that's not about the lesson, but my son has kind of been getting into this a little bit. He sent me this YouTube link of this guy, very smart guy. And I laugh. It makes me laugh because we don't have a clue. I remember telling me one time that one scientist has said, the universe is not stranger than you imagine. It's stranger than you can imagine. And that's what we're beginning to understand. And so one of these days, Let's Get Metaphysical, we're going to share all these videos because you'll really like, ooh, I'm glad I have an open mind. Anyway, this whole change began with a Copernican discovery because the church was having trouble resetting the calendar. So they brought Copernicus in, and he said, Copernicus, we need you to figure out this calendar business. And he did. And so when he came back to report to them, he said, I got some good news, and I got some bad news. And I said, Copernicus, what's the good news? He said, I figured out the calendar. Copernicus, you are the man. And then he says, that's the bad news. We're not the center of the universe. And the church went, hold on, Copernicus. This is the first time. Now, don't quote me on this, but I think it was the first time on the planet these words were ever uttered. They told him, what you talking about, Copernicus? Because it wasn't Gary Coleman. God bless Gary Coleman. Anyway, it rattled their cage because now all of a sudden, everything had been, the church had been the authority of everything, and now the very foundation that God made everything for us, oh, that's vain. They said, no, that's not the way it is. And so it's just an interesting change. And so they were discarded the whole idea of God. And all that's, of course, that's all changing again. That's why it's coming back around. And so then this brings us into the postmodern stage. And that was only 150 years ago. And it says that it was really notable in the 1960s with the hippies, which basically us, that made all these changes. And the modern stage is, among other things, the home of the woo-woo stage. And there's much criticism about the woo-woo stage, as you know. I'm sure you probably heard it. Somebody just said it. Unity is a cult and all this other kind of stuff. But we will, as Unity students, we're going to recognize a lot of the terminology and the phrase of the modern stage. Because it says that in modern stage, truth is absolute and values are absolute. And the postmodern stage is saying we construct our own truth. And it's all relative. Postmodernism says the world is sensitive self, the pluralistic worldview, and believing there are many ways of looking at reality. Now, so the ups and downs of the postmodern, the downs is all beliefs are relative. That's what it says, and equally true. The upside is that we started to embrace diversity, feminism, civil rights, spirituality, creativity, and cherishing the earth. So this all sounds very familiar to us because there's a lot of postmodern in Unity. But in summary, the modern was filled with scientific exploration, and the postmodern is filled with spiritual exploration. And we're going to leave a lot of that discussion to the group. It should be interesting. It should be very interesting. It gives us a chance to look in the mirror and say, who are we, where are we, and where are we going, and things like that. So I'll say one final thing about the postmodern that he brings up, because he's still very, very much, some of the Southern Baptists still comes out. And he says, one of the chapters is called, well, it's not a chapter, it's a section. The problem with religious cafeteria. I said, ooh. Uh-oh, because Unity says that sometimes, if you don't like it, pick what you like and leave what you don't like. That's what you do when you go to HEB, isn't it? You pick what you like and you leave what you don't like. Same thing when you go to a store to buy clothes or something. You pick what you like and leave what you don't like. Of course, the criticism of that fails to bring into account that that's how the Bible was put together. I mean, the council picked what they liked and left what they didn't like. So, we're just all growing together, and it's all cool. So I wanted to introduce an idea in the book that really rang with me and might with you as well. What he calls the three faces of God. Now, when I first read the book, I did a lesson on three faces of God. That was a long time ago. And then when I did the second version of the lesson, I changed it to three phases of God. Because as you know, I'm a big proponent of discarding that old anthropomorphic language. It really kind of keeps us held back from growing spiritually. And I just don't see that God has a face, one or three. You know, if you wanted to stretch it, you could say, well, he actually has 8 billion faces on this planet alone. But, you know, that's the expressive side of nature. And those of us who are Catholic grew up with the idea of this three parts of God, the three persons, as they call it. And I was reading about St. Augustine, who a lot of our stuff is based on. And St. Augustine really struggled with this. It said he wrote a treatise on the Trinity that's 15 books long and took him 10 years to write about the Trinity alone. St. Augustine was quite the guy. And one of the things that he came up with is that we are tripartite beings by nature. He turned in and said, this is how our soul is. This is how our mind is in three parts. They're not separate, but they're distinct. One of the things he says, for example, he's got many. One of them says, when you say the statement, I love myself, you're saying there is I is the lover, myself is the beloved, and love is the action. And they're three distinct things, but they all come from the same mind. So he uses all these kind of examples to express this Trinity idea. And of course, Catholics, you know, the Father, Son, Holy Spirit. And we say mind, idea, expression. Psychology says conscious, superconscious, subconscious. So these three things, I want to take a look at that right now. Before I do, though, I'm going to introduce a word, if you don't know it. The word is panentheism. Anybody familiar with it? Yes, panentheism. It's actually in our metaphysics book. And what it is, see, there's three ways of seeing God. One of them is called theism, and that's when you have the big man in the sky idea, a God that's separate from us. And then there's a pantheism, which is like from Hindu, and it says that God is everything, that God is all creation. But there's a third way, and it's called with an E-N in there, panentheism. And in the panentheism, God is everything and then some. It's almost like, you know, when we get together as a group, let's say, like I always said at the Cowboy football game, and we all yelling, but it creates a bigger, something bigger. So God is the sum of everything and then some. And so when Jesus walked the planet, everybody believed that God was out there. And Jesus said, God is within. Well, panentheism says God is both out there and in here, both. And so Reverend Smith, actually, he likes that, which is good. He has a lot of parts like us. So the words are, being out there and being in here, the word is transcendent, that impersonal side of God that we talk about, and then the immanent, the inside of us. And in the book, the Unity Metaphysics book says this about us. He says, the human mind has a unique ability to identify with the absolute and at the same time to participate in the changing processes of the relative. We're able to walk that walk, to have that dance, and it's very interesting. So he says that when you see God in this panentheistic manner, you see it in 3D. And this is what he says. He says that Jesus talked about God, with God, and as God. I said, wow, that's very interesting. So he questions, he says, so how big is your God? And is your God close enough? And is your God you enough? And I think we're going to get into some discussion. So he says we can't leave any of the phases out because then it's incomplete. He calls this the Expanded Trinity. And he says, I propose that we come together in a more integral space and affirm all three divine highlights as true but partial. So he says the three phases of God are this: the I, the inner face of God, the inner phase of God. God as first person is God as me. And then there's the second, the intimate phase of God. The second person as that wondrous aspect of God that he spoke about, Abba Father, that spirit. And then the third, the it, the infinite phase of God, a third person that God that we speak about, and the great mystery, the I am. So there's these three elements that make it all personal. And I want to wrap this up because he says that there's just too much to cover in this book. Because there's even stuff, I haven't talked about some of the chapters in there. Anyway, I want to leave you with something that they do, and it's their version of the sign of the cross. He says that they stand up and they spread their arms out like this, and they say, "Infinite God, in whom I live and move and have my being." And then they do the namaste little pose, and they say, "Intimate God, you are always with me." And then they cross their hearts, and they say, "Inner God, I am the light of the world." And that's the three phases of God. And we're going to talk about this. Thank you. Have a wonderful week.